This video represents my part in Project Revolution, a large collaborative project between myself and many other YouTube channels all around, as you may imagine, the subject of revolutions. If you're coming to this video as a regular viewer of my own channel, then I'd recommend that you go to the link below. You'll find a playlist for all the other videos in this collaboration project if you'd like to see some of the other ones there. And if you happen to be coming over from History House Productions video, or any other videos in the project, then consider this something of a pit stop on your journey, because I'm not going to be talking so much about a physical revolution as much as a cultural revolution. But not that one. Not that one. Something very different. I mean to say a revolution of perception, of how people saw things in the past. And in more particular terms, we're going to be talking about the perception of the military, of the armed forces, and how that changed over the years, particularly in the early modern period up to the modern. Now, of course, this is going to be an extraordinarily broad video. Not only, of course, are we covering a very wide time frame, 1600s up to the very late 1800s, but also we're covering a very complicated subject, that of how people in the past saw a very broad institution, the military. So when it comes to this video, just consider it really to be a starting point from which you might maybe better understand the nature of the military and how it was seen during these time periods, how its purpose was perceived, things like that. Do note that there are always going to be exceptions, and very strong exceptions, to the guidelines that I'm explaining here in this video. This is, again, a very broad topic. So with that little disclaimer out of the way, I think we are ready to begin with the day's subject. So onwards, my dear friends, to Project Revolution. Wellington once famously referred to his soldiers as the mere scum of the earth, and this was hardly a perception that was limited to people like the Duke of Wellington, who was rather notoriously snooty. But it was a very common perception throughout, really, the majority of the 17th and 18th century, if not really for the majority of history, let's be honest. And particularly, I think, in British society, where, broadly speaking, standing armies were distrusted at best and just outright hated as active tools of oppression by tyrants at the absolute worst end of things, thinking like English Civil War and whatnot. Armies were oftentimes very small, and they were used by princes and kings merely as tools of political power. And the soldiery, along similar lines, did not really represent, except for maybe some places in Germany, for example, a very large portion of the public population. It didn't really attract much of their attention, and the activities of the military didn't usually concern civilian populations so long as those civilian populations were not directly involved in a campaign. Again, at least when compared with the extent to which the military was involved in civilian life in later years. All these things are proportional, of course. And along similar lines, the fact that these militaries were not really fighting for unified nationalistic causes so much as for the gain of the ancien regimes, as it were, well, most of the times when men enlisted in these armed forces, they weren't really doing so for feelings of patriotic zeal or nationalistic sentiment. They were doing so for the practicalities of the thing. They were doing it for the pay, which was usually somewhat better than a laborer's pay, for the job security, as certainly the military is going to keep you on if they can let you in. They'll keep you on for quite a long while. For steady supplies of food and clothing, things like that, and just a place to be. And, of course, many as well would have enlisted to escape a previous life, if you will. A very commonly derided example in the 18th century was that of the lad who enlists to the king's army in order to escape the father of a woman whom he had a bit of a time with, as it were. Despite the fact that they were paid more than day laborers, they were still all things considered, paid very little considering what they had to go through. They saw many stoppages in their pay, you see, for things like uniforms, rations, for even their own medical care. They were expected to pay for these things. Oftentimes, they were fed very, very poorly, and oftentimes this food was actually of very poor quality, and particularly on campaign, and even worse, of course, if the campaign is a particularly difficult one. And while certainly it was not a rule of the time period, many armies on campaigns often found themselves, as a result of that poor quality food, living off of the land around themselves. Now, sometimes, yes, this meant looting and ravaging across the countryside, but even when it didn't mean ravaging and looting and whatnot, even when the soldiers were, for example, paying for their food and paying for services which they utilized on the march and the like, even still what this represented, or at least what it could represent, was effectively a supplanting of local populations. A good example of that would actually be in the occupation of Boston in the very early years, or I should say the years leading up to the American War of Independence, because the military occupation was so large in comparison to the normal population of the city, and because the soldiers were paid so little by the regular army, oftentimes they found themselves, in order to get by comfortably, having to take up secondary forms of employment. One of the massive concerns, one of the real major root causes of conflict between the two sides was the fact that British soldiers were taking jobs from local Bostonians, and that sort of thing would have been quite common wherever the military goes across all of Europe, wherever they're garrisoned, things like that. They're taking up extra jobs, they're taking up extra food, they're taking up supplies, and all of these things are going to impact, whether positively or negatively, it could go either way, but they are going to impact civilian populations. Maybe not the civilian population on the whole, but in the immediate area wherever they are, soldiers tend to be a nuisance, and you want them gone as soon as they will go. And what's more, along similar lines of whenever the army is there, it tends to be rather bad news for you, would be that alongside the idea that the military in this time period is used to fight foreign wars, well, the monarch is also using them to keep control in their own realms, their own dominions. And in the 18th century, largely before the advent of modern-day police forces, the military was actually used largely in a peacekeeping role whenever the need arose. They were often used to quell riots and, quote-unquote, restore order with, of course, lethal violence. There were no non-lethal methods back in the day to quell riots, and so oftentimes soldiers would be, doing things like firing into crowds and advancing upon them with bayonets, and there are a number of very bloody examples of the military, shall we say, getting an awful lot of very bad PR because of their actions in these policing activities. Perhaps the most notorious of all of these being the massacre at Peter Loo, in which the policing forces lost control and actually rode through crowds, ended up killing a small child, something which again does not do very well to ingratiate armed forces with civilian populations. Soldiers were often portrayed during this time period, though again, not always portrayed, as brutish, crude, rapacious, destructive, and uncaring beings. Other times, they might be mocked for their pomp and their airs without the actual competency to back it up. And there are all sorts of very old political cartoons doing both of these things, making fun of the dirty, brutish, and horrid little creatures that are the enlisted men, and then the pompous officers with no actual ability to lead those men into battle and turn them into an army, as they so often claimed to be doing. And these stereotypes, these ideas, were often particularly brutal, particularly true in many ways, during peacetime, when the army was not actively necessary or seen as being actively necessary to defend the nation, and so really you only had those bad aspects really shining through with no examples of glory and heroism abroad to sort of remind you, oh right, that's why we have an army to begin with. Now again, it must be stressed that there were always exceptions to this. There was variance. There were a great deal many individuals who took great pride in the military, and there is something to be said for the pomp and circumstance of the parade, particularly on its effects that it can have on, say, say, a local village population seeing a recruiting band marching through city streets, and men often would speak about how they are inspired by the colors flying and the music flaring up and the very gallant speeches given by recruiting sergeants and whatnot. There is value to all of that. Again, this is all a very broad subject, but for the most part, the military was not viewed during the 18th century, or 17th century indeed, as a very respectable place to go. And oftentimes, this perception of the military as a bad place to be, ultimately, often tied into how the men were actually treated, both by their officers and by the public at large. Again, they were not fed very well, they were not paid very well, and as you may imagine, the actual treatment of soldiers, for example, after their service, was oftentimes very poor. We do see, at the later stages of the 18th century, the beginnings of attempts at things like soldiers' pensions and soldiers' hospitals, sort of an attempt to alleviate the extreme poverty that oftentimes struck soldiers after their service, but again, compared to efforts that would come later on, and taken in our modern eyes, they were really very, very little. The idea is only just beginning to really come around that, oh, hey, wait, maybe we should be taking care of these people after the fact, and it was not a terribly, shall we say, widespread practice. Because while to be an officer during this time period was to be a gentleman, to be an honourable, a chivalrous, it was a heroic affair to be an officer in the 18th century, to be a soldier, to be a mere enlisted man, was often far, far less. They were more like chattel, to be led and corralled by those gentlemen. They had to be kept in rein by the more chivalrous individuals, lest they lose themselves in their inherently vicious nature. That is the biggest distinction to make, is above all else, the soldier, the enlisted man, was, during the 18th century, viewed to be inherently a vicious being, only inspired to and kept to honorable standards and actions by the officers placed above them. That distinction was extraordinarily strong. You could only trust the enlisted men by their officers, and they had to be run and ruled over by gentlemen, lest they lose themselves in a barbarous nature. Now compare this with modern sentiments, where even the lowest of enlisted men is viewed as something almost more than a man, as a representative of his nation's values, as their defender. To join the military is often something that people of all social and economic classes can take pride in, and it's often viewed as a positive career choice. Even so far as for those individuals who are perceived in our modern times as quote-unquote the scum of the earth, those lower orders, as it were, it's often seen as a way for them to improve their lot in life, to fix themselves, to get on the right track. It's seen as a way to give an individual drive and purpose where they may not have had any before. This is an extraordinarily sharp distinction from what we had in the 18th century. So what happened in the last, 200 years, even less, to cause such an extraordinarily dramatic shift in how we perceive the military? Well, I think this shift is actually one that we can rather explicitly trace back to the 19th century, indeed to the mid to late 19th century, and specifically of new imperialism. So what do I mean by that? Well, the 19th century was a period of extreme expansion in many, many ways. Economic expansion, technological expansion, and of course, of military expansion. In the Victorian era, literacy rates are rising immensely, and this is alongside a rapidly expanding middle class, again with that Industrial Revolution and Second Industrial Revolution. And these new middle classes, to put it simply, are seeking entertainment, as they actually now have the funds and the time both to actually dedicate to spending on these leisure activities. The Victorian era really is the beginning of so many of our modern day leisure activities. The beach is a Victorian invention. Public organized sports are largely Victorian inventions. When they go beyond that, it is just village festivals and whatnot. So many of our public parks and green spaces, these are all Victorian inventions, Victorian ideals. And among among all of these new leisure activities that the Victorians are looking for, they begin looking for more reading materials, more cheaply available reading materials, things that are accessible and easy to read for everyone, especially for those middle and even lower classes at times. This becomes an absolute golden age of printing for books, of course, and for newspapers, even for the lower orders to be able to read and appreciate and understand a little bit more about the world around them. And of course, particularly popular during this time period are two things: biographies and travel literature. After all, in the mid to late Victorian era, new technologies, alongside the economic and military incentive to do so, are encouraging various nation states to really begin exploring the world around them. They begin, so to say, unlocking new parts of the world that were hitherto unknown and mysterious, locked away to the European peoples. Exotic lands, alien lands to the Victorians. And of course, what land could be more exotic, more mysterious, more alien to the Victorians, and as such, more fascinating for the domestic populations to read and learn more about than, of course, Africa, the dark continent itself? Even those aspects of Africa which was known to the Europeans was strange enough for them, with these strange fauna and exotic beasts and native peoples who lived, at least according to the logic of the time period, not so much in reality, but in an almost Hobbesian state of nature, totally unlike, at least this is a fair assessment, they lived in a fashion totally unlike the quote-unquote civilized peoples of the West. And of course, it was an unknown. It was called the Dark Continent not as a racialist term, although in fairness pretty much everything else was in racialist terms, but because the interior of the continent was unexplored. That exotic, unknown, truly alien world captured the imagination of the expanding Victorian middle classes, and particularly its exploration, the process of these Europeans piercing into the interior and laying claim to these lands for themselves. These were foreign adventures which were very exciting to the domestic population to read about in their storybooks. These were adventures. As these middle and lower classes have more disposable income to spend on things like books and newspapers and the like, they are also interested in these new discoveries. That is what they're reading about. That's what they are surrounded by. These are exciting times for them. And of course, this exploration of Africa's interior by the European adventurers and missionaries and scientists, which again is all made possible by these new Victorian technologies and medicines and the like, was matched by a new age of imperial expansion, the Scramble for Africa, in which a small number of European powers divided and conquered near the entirety of the continent. So as the people are learning more about these exotic new worlds, as they're reading and following the adventures of these adventurers abroad in these untamed and wild lands, so very far removed from the usual, again, Victorian moralist sensibilities, they're also learning about the military actions in these areas. They're learning and they are following very closely the conquests of these new regions and the expeditions by soldiers, by European soldiers, by people like them, running up in direct conflict with people so totally alien. It's a dynamic, it's a power dynamic that is very compelling to the readership. This idea of conflict, of struggle, of civilization versus barbarity, of our way of life versus the other way of life. An other way of life, of course, which is really often codified and portrayed as an inherently lesser one. Indeed, in the racialist terms of the 19th century, this is a look at the enlightened, the dignified, and the pure against the unenlightened, the savage, and the impure. And what we begin to see is the usual mysticism of nationalistic mythology expanding, further and further and further in this time period. Again, it had always existed before. There had always been these classic tales of, Wellington at Waterloo, things like that. Wellington was treated very much as a traditional, as a classic imperial hero, but it's in the late Victorian era that we see a massive ramping up of these sentiments, and at a time when the nation is not under direct threat, but instead fighting these little wars abroad. And this rising interest among the domestic civilian population in the activities of the army is naturally going to be directly encouraged by a variety of different agents who have a vested interest in that growing interest and support of the state and its military actions abroad. As we said, the Victorian era was a point of extreme economic expansion. And as part of this new economic expansion, we're going to see, of course, a lot of new roads and rail stations and public buildings and spaces. And, well, they're going to have to assign some sort of name to all of these things, so, well, why not name them after those people whom the public just adores? And not only that, of course, but those people whom you want the public to adore. Why don't you name them after the imperial heroes? We see massive numbers of new parks and other green and public spaces opened up by the Victorians, and, well, we're going to have to decorate all of these public spaces with something, fill them with something. Well, what could be more appropriate than monuments and memorials to the glorious fallen, whom, again, the public is now taking, for the first time, a very keen interest in their actions abroad? What better way to bring these sacrifices home and show them off to the public than by building great big monuments of heroic soldiers thrusting bayonets forward to defend fallen comrades and all that sort of thing? After all, it is by virtue of their sacrifice that all of these things are taking place. It is by virtue of the imperial expansion that the economy is now able to facilitate all of these new things. Or at least so it seems, because of course as you walk down that new Kitchener Road, or as you sit in the park underneath that new monument to the 2nd Battalion Coldstream Guards honoring their action at X or Y battle in Egypt or some such, well, naturally, you begin to make an association in the mind of, well, this lovely new sign of progress, the idea of progress in the Victorian era being very, very popular. These new signs of progress are clearly being associated with the military and with that martial progress, that martial process. The new park is owed to the dedication, to the virtue, to the sacrifice of those men in stone standing so heroically, so triumphantly above you. It is thanks to the military this idea slowly begins to develop, and their sacrifice, that this pleasure is now made possible. Not mere survival, but pleasure, happiness, liberty, all those sorts of things. The people, of course, are hungry for reading materials, and what better stories to give them than the heroic biographies and accounts of those same mythical heroes representing them abroad. And of course, if you happen to be that mystical hero, if you happen to be Lord Roberts, or Chinese Gordon, or Lord Kitchener, then you also have a very vested interest in giving these people those sorts of reading materials about yourself. And members of the military actually begin working very closely with publishers who are eager for any story that will sell, no matter how embellished it may be, to have this mythos spread deeper and deeper. We have the creation, it's half natural, out of the adventurism and exoticism of it all, and the genuine interest of the public, and it's also half artificial by the military, by the state, and by private business interests. We have the creation of the imperial hero, of a new kind of imperial hero, well beyond the extent that people like Lord Wellington ever reached. Now, something that's happening alongside of, and also contributing massively to, this changing perception of the soldier from a wastrel and a scoundrel to the exploring conqueror and representative of his nation in the exotic lands abroad, is the fact that militaries of the world during this time period are expanding. In order to control these large empires, the forces grow larger. In order to deal with modern logistical issues and compete with neighbors, they reform and grow more complicated. The armed forces become more technical, more professional, and officer corps begin opening to members of different social and economic classes. In some nations like France, you even have policies of conscription, which make the military a shared and formative experience among very vast portions of the population. To put it very simply, the military during the 19th century is slowly taking up a larger and larger portion of the public sphere, not only by virtue of the public's rising interest in the military and its association with rising economic expansion, but also by its own merits and its own scale as well. The people are seeing the military so much more in the Victorian era than they ever have before. We have regional regiments getting developed. We have this idea of regimental pride based on geographic locations, particularly again in Great Britain. More and more people know of a soldier. More and more people are related to soldiers, friends with soldiers. We start seeing them more regularly in the streets and on parade and in our advertising and in various promotions of politicians and other state aspects and affairs and whatnot. And what's more is because of the nature of what this military is involved in foreign adventurism, in all of these Victorian little wars, we're only seeing the best aspects of this military. We're not really seeing the devastation that they are wreaking on these small African native communities. We're not seeing them burn down the villages. We're not even seeing our own wounded. We're only hearing of the heroism, of the glory, of the triumph abroad. We're seeing the military in the way that it wants to be portrayed, at its absolute height. And even when you do have those rare occasions where there is a disaster, which is of course all the more striking because of how rare they are, those Isandlwanas, or those, I forget the name, but those shipwrecks where soldiers are said to be standing at attention as the ship goes down because they let the women and children board the ships first, all of these, terrible disasters and whatnot, even those become framed by authors, by the military itself, by state agents, and by nationalists within the civilian community. They're all framed as glorious last stands and defiant acts of heroism for queen and country, representative of the tenacity, of the spirit, and of the discipline and the honor of the British soldier, or any other soldier. Sorry, I'm sort of going onto a British rant here, but any, of the nation's soldiers, as opposed to what it really is, which is, of course, a dismal failure. How many wonderful portraits have you seen of those last heroic soldiers clutching on to the colors as they're dying on the fields of Africa or India or some such, as they get discovered by their comrades? And of course, always it is to be redeemed by some greater victory in the future. When you manage to frame even a terrible defeat somewhat in your favor, you know that you're doing very well in public perception. And of course, another very large part of this changing perception is going to be the fact that the military is no longer involved in domestic policing actions, because of course you have the advent of the police forces who are now able to deal with those sorts of things. We are only again seeing the military in this positive light. We are only hearing about them as they are exploring exotic and strange new lands. They become effectively, in all of this new literature and this new artwork, encountering these alien worlds, they become sort of like a placeholder for us. We read about them interacting with this alien world as a placeholder for any other European. They begin representing their nations as moral agents abroad, as representatives of what it is to be British, to be French, to be whatever it may be. Even during periods of effective peace, which is to say that a period of time when the actual existence of the nation itself is not actively being threatened, we see an extraordinary amount of interest in military affairs, the sort of thing that would really only ever take place when there is a conflict which is actively affecting a civilian population. Here we see a civilian population fascinated by military affairs, even though they are, directly speaking at least, not really affecting or impacting their daily lives. The sorts of sentiments that you may have only ever seen become more common in a society during For example, the Napoleonic Wars or some such historically become, during this time period, much more of a standard, no matter what's going on abroad. And they're being multiplied in intensity alongside these nationalistic lines. Again, this time period, the late Victorians, the early Edwardians, for example, are an extraordinarily nationalistic people, and you can see this in so much of their media. And this is all to say absolutely nothing of the changing sexual perceptions of the Victorian era, which play another massive role in this whole thing, of the increasing emphasis you see on this time period on masculinity and of manliness, and how these traits were so very often closely related and compared to martial ability and prowess, the ability to visit violence in a controlled and dignified fashion are very traditional, masculine, Victorian traits, and the exact sort of thing that they valued in their military. All of these factors, and many, many more besides, I'm sure, saw that the overall perception, and again, I do mean this in the most broad of possible terms, but the overall perception of the common soldier changed dramatically throughout the 19th century, so that by the end of the period it looked entirely distinctive from that of the early modern period of the 18th century. Our modern ideals of the soldier as proud, as courageous, masculine, chivalrous, an individual dedicated to sacrifice and honor, are indeed extraordinarily modern ideas. And when you're studying matters of military history previously, particularly before the modern period, it is very important to understand that change in perception, how dramatic it was, how rapid it was, and how modern it was. And I certainly think that that sort of dramatic change warrants a term such as revolution. Though, in the end, again, this is only a generality. It would still be the case in the Victorian era, as indeed many would argue that it is still the case today, that these ideals of how soldiers were viewed by society did not always translate perfectly into how the soldiers were treated by society. And this contradiction is perhaps nowhere better noted than with that poet of empire in Rudyard Kipling's Tommy. Yes, makin' Malka uniforms that guard you while you sleep is cheaper than them uniforms, and they're starvation cheap. And hustlin' drunken soldiers when they're goin' large a bit is 5 times better business than paradin' in full kit. And it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and Tommy how's your soul? But it's thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. The drums begin to roll, my boys, the drums begin to roll. Oh, it's thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. You talk of better food for us, and schools and fires and all. We'll wait for extra rations, if you treat us rational. Don't mess about the cookroom slops, but prove it to our face. The widow's uniform is not the soldier man's disgrace. For it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and chuck him out, the brute. But it's savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot. And it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and anything you please. And Tommy ain't a bloomin' fool. You bet that Tommy sees. This has been my contribution to Project Revolution, a collaborative project between myself and many other YouTube channels on the subject of revolution. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about the subject that I talked about in specific today, then I would heartily recommend the book Heroic Imperialists in Africa by Bernice Abbé. Now, do note that the title is very much tongue-in-cheek. It is not a piece of populist history, but it is a very fascinating look at the effective creation of the new imperial hero during the late Victorian era, and it focuses largely on the British and French militaries and how they promoted themselves to the public and their activities to the public during this time period. I'll include a link in the description down below if you are interested in purchasing that book. It is absolutely fantastic, and it is what inspired this video and where I got the grand majority of my information from. So if you'd like to read a little bit more, that is an excellent place to get started. And otherwise, keeping in mind today's lesson that the military was not always seen in such a strong and wonderful light as it is today, I encourage you to forge on in our little video series with the next subject, brought to you by Mr. Jack Ruckham. A link, of course, to that playlist and his video in the description down below. Of course, as always, I wish to offer the greatest of thanks and my gratitude to my ever beneficent supporting classes over on patreon.com. It is by virtue of their support that I am able to continue making videos and projects like this. And of course, to you, my dear viewer, thank you so very much for watching. And of course, until the next time, I am, and I shall remain, of course, your most humble and obedient of servants.